The car moved steadily along the empty winter road. Inside, the soft warmth of the heater fogged up the edges of the windows, blurring the bare branches and snow-dusted fields that slipped by outside. Scattered details filled the interior of the car. A faded dash with faint cracks tracing across it. A small, dented compass resting near the windshield, its needle wavering with each turn in the road. Feathers tied with a bit of old worn string hung from the rearview mirror. They bobbed gently with the car's motion. At the wheel was Sean, his gaze focused but relaxed, eyes tracing the road ahead. He turned now and then, gesturing slightly at the unseen figure beside him. An occasional smile hinted at a presence in the passenger seat, a companion.
So bright.
Through the car's windows, trees rose and fell along the roadside, their limbs bare and reaching against a white-gray winter sky. The road stretched on, empty and endless. Sean's smile softened as he cast one last glance towards the unseen passenger. Then, darkness, leaving only the lingering memory of warmth in the cold, dark silence. Sean lay face down in the snow, his head turned slightly, half buried in the fresh powder. A thin stream of blood ran from a cut on his forehead, staining the white snow beside him. His eyes fluttered open slowly, struggling to focus. Disoriented, he lay motionless, his gaze drifting as he tried to piece together where he was and how he got here. Snow drifted gently through the trees, painting the dense forest in soft blankets of white. The air was crisp, and only the muted sound of light snowfall broke the stillness of the woods. The vast expanse of snow-covered ground seemed untouched. An icy chill seeped through his clothes, nudging him awake in aching pulses. Pain shot through his head, his skull throbbing with each heartbeat as he pushed his body up out of the snow. He reached for and touched his wound on his head, examining his blood-soaked fingers. A moment of nausea causing him to vomit. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering and bewildered. His thoughts felt tangled as his mind was submerged underwater, muffling everything he tried to grasp. His own name, his memories, they all seemed like scrambled fragments out of reach. He took a deep breath, and he forced himself to sit up fully. Surveying his surroundings, he noticed how the snowfall covered any tracks, obscuring any clue as how he arrived here. His eyelids grew heavy, his vision began to blur again. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the fog creeping over his senses. After a few moments, he opened them again, his breath coming in slow, visible puffs. The biting cold pressed in, urgent and unforgiving. Realizing he couldn't sit still any longer, he grit his teeth and pushed himself to his feet, fighting the jolts of pain. No sense of direction, no familiar landmarks, each direction looking the same as the last. He scanned the landscape looking for any hint of help, only to conclude that he was very much alone and lost. Propping himself against a tree, the cold air bit at him as he huddled himself, rubbing his hands together, blowing on them. He began to tear strips of fabric from his shirt, hidden underneath his sweater and coat. He worked with shaking, desperate hands, pressing a makeshift pad of cloth against his wound and tying it in place with his tie like a bandana. He wrapped smaller strips around his red-tinted hands for warmth, scooped a handful of snow to his mouth, letting it melt to wet his parched throat. In his pocket, his fingers brushed something solid. He pulled out a wallet. Opening it, he found a driver's license. His face, his name, his address, but it all felt strange and foreign. He thumbed through a few scraps of paper before his gaze landed on a small, worn photograph of a woman standing in front of a house. She looked beautiful, familiar somehow, though his memory wouldn't place just who she was. Flipping it over, he read the neat handwritten script. Love always, Sarah. Yet no memories stirred. Nothing about her face unlocked anything. He tucked the photo back into his wallet and returned it to his jacket. He searched through the remaining pockets and pulled out a smartphone. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly shattered by the sight of the phone's cracked, unresponsive screen. He pressed buttons, but the device remained lifeless. Frustrated, he tossed it aside, and it disappeared into the snow. His fingers grazed another small item, a slim matchbook. 3 matches left. He carefully slid them back into his pocket, his survival instincts awakening. Looking around once more, Sean struggled to find any clue that might guide him, but nothing in the blanketed forest offered answers. Shivering, he picked a direction, squaring his shoulders against the cold. Determined, he took his first steps into the unknown, leaving behind only faint traces in the snow. The snow crunched beneath him as he began to move through the lifeless woods. Sean stumbled forwards, his boots crunching through the dense snow and underbrush. Every step was labored, his legs dragging as if Earth itself tried to anchor him down. The woods around him were vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. His breath formed clouds in the chilly air, each one slower, heavier. A hint of fear crept into his eyes as he scanned the horizon, noting how the sun dipped even closer to the edge of the world. The day was slipping away. His foot snagged on a hidden root and he lurched forward, catching himself at the last second, but the near fall shattered his momentum. He stopped, swaying slightly, shoulders drooping. His head bowed, and finally he collapsed to his knees, his body giving into the exhaustion he could no longer ignore. Silence blanketed the forest, broken only by the faint sound of creaking trees. The determination in his mind, a desperation that had kept him moving, faded into nothing. As the last of the daylight began slipping away, Sean looked up, a realization settling over him. The chances of rescue were gone for the day. He was on his own for the night. He forced himself back to his feet. There was no time for panic. He had to survive, which meant finding shelter. He scoured the area, finding a thick cluster of low-hanging branches and thick shrubs. He began to gather what he could, shivering as the cold wind pierced through his inadequate jacket. The branches were brittle in his numb fingers, but he worked methodically, weaving them together poorly, creating a makeshift barrier against the biting cold. He had never built a shelter before, and he assembled it as best he can, using whichever methods that seemed to work. When the shelter finally stood, more a haphazard cover than anything else, he turned to gather kindling. His hands, trembling and stiff from the cold, struggled to snap off twigs from nearby trees. Some broke easily, others resisted, but soon he had a small pile of twigs. He crouched down and with a fumbling motion pulled the booklet of matches from his pocket. Carefully, he tore a piece of cardboard from the booklet, placing it beneath the twigs as a base. He struck the match against a rough strip, only to watch the flame flicker and die almost immediately.
Shit,
he muttered, voice thick with frustration and exhaustion. He reached for another match, but this time he paused. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help. Slowly, his fingers found his wallet tucked away in his jacket pocket. He opened it, pulling out a few crumpled receipts and other scrap papers. He placed them on top of the cardboard, layering the dry paper carefully. Holding his breath, he struck the match one more time, steadying his shaking hand and blocking the wind with his other as the flame sputtered to life. This time the fire took. A small orange glow flickered beneath the twigs, then spreading by his cautious breaths. He fed it gently, watching as the fire grew, casting a warm light that began to push back the shadows of the night. In the silence, with only the crackling of fire for company, Sean huddled near the flames. As dusk settled over the woods, the shadows deepened and a faint chill crept through the air. Sean sat huddled beside the small fire, his back pressed firmly against a tree. The flames flickered, casting a warm glow over his face and offering a reprieve from the cold that had gnawed at him since he had awoken in this strange, snow-covered place. As he gazed at the fire, his hand slipped into his pocket to retrieve something precious. The last match. His fingers brushed the rough surface, feeling the weight of its worth. He tucked it carefully back into his pocket, but as his fingers lingered there, he felt something crinkled and familiar pressing against the lining of his pocket. Curious, he pulled it out. A battered, mangled cigarette. He chuckled quietly and smiled, as if greeting an old friend he'd forgotten he had. He broke off the busted end and gently lit the cigarette with a twig from the fire. Cupping the flame, he leaned forward and with one gentle inhale, the cigarette flared to life. His first drag was like a shock to his system, a rush of warmth and familiarity that spread through him like an embrace of an old memory. He closed his eyes, savoring it as fragments of himself began to return. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out his wallet, his gaze drifting to the small photograph he had found earlier. He removed it again, carefully, almost reverently. Her face gazed back at him, full of life and warmth. There was a softness in her expression, a glow that radiated love and gentleness. Sean smiled back at her, his smile retreating into sadness. On the back, the familiar words, "Love always, Sarah," glowed faintly in the firelight. As he looked at her again, something inside him unlocked. A rush of memory poured in, filling the empty spaces. A vision of her laughing, her hand reaching out to him, her smile so vivid, he felt he could almost touch it. More memories followed, unspooling like a film. Moments of them walking together, her hair catching the sunlight, her laughter filling the void. He saw her curled up beside him on the couch, her hand in his hand. Her voice soft and warm in his ear, her caressing kiss, their embrace in the settling sunlight billowing through softly blowing curtains in an open window. Lost in the memories, his thumb grazed over her image in the photo, tracing the contours of her face. He remembered the feel of her skin, warm and alive beneath his touch. He reached out to the fire, his fingers hovering near the flames as if he could somehow touch that warmth from them, imagining it was her. His last fleeting memory was a clear one, sharp and bright. Her hand in his as they walked towards his car, and then visions of them both getting in. The memory slowly slipped away, leaving him gazing into the fire. His fingers still extended, searching for the touch that was hers for just another moment. The woods closed in around him as dusk deepened, but he remained lost in thought, the warmth of the fire his only tether to the past he had just rekindled. The morning was bleak, silent, and gray. Sean, deep in sleep, lay curled up, huddled in his coat by the remains of the fire, its charred embers now cold and lifeless. His face was pale, frozen-like. For a brief moment he felt something, a hand, soft and warm, resting against his cheek. He awoke suddenly, startled, searching. He whipped his head around, heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. Only the trees, standing silent and indifferent as the reality of his situation returned. Shivering, he let out a ragged breath, rubbing his face as he tried to pull himself together. The cold seeped in deeper, bone deep, and he gritted his teeth against it. He stood slowly, feeling every sore muscle and bruise from the day before. His movements were stiff, pained. His hands discolored and aching from the cold. He took a few hesitant steps around the shelter, trying to shake off the chill, hindered by his moist, frozen clothing. Another handful of snow melted in his mouth as he scanned his surroundings, desperately searching for any direction, any sign that might lead him out. But the woods still stretched endlessly, unfamiliar. Wrapping his coat tighter around himself, he inhaled deeply and decided to press on. His feet crunched softly over the snow as he looked back at his makeshift shelter, leaving it behind. His legs ached with each step, but he forced himself forward, his breath shallow and visible in the cold air. For the first time, the sun peeked through the clouds after what seemed like a lifetime of gloomy, overcast skies. It warmed his face as he glared at it, squinting his eyes. A fleeting moment of warmth as the clouds once again swallowed the sunlight. He pushed on. The world passed in a series of quick, lonely images. The narrow passages between tall pines. A steep slope he clambered up. A small frozen stream that snaked its way between the trees. His progress was relentless, driven by pure will as he pushed through the deep snow and trudged over the frozen tundra. At some point, he emerged from the dense woods, stepping out into a vast open field. The sight was both daunting and freeing, the sheer emptiness stretching before him like an endless sea of white blending into the gray open sky. Across the wide field on the opposite side, more woods stood tall. The wind howled across the field, unbroken by the trees, and Sean bundled his coat tighter, bracing himself against the biting cold. He trudged across the snow-covered terrain, each step heavier than the last. The snow ever more deeper in the open fields compared to the sheltered landscape of the dense woods. His steps uneven, he struggled across, fumbling on occasions. The deep snow slowed and exhausted him, his feet frozen and aching. He knew his chances of being rescued were increased in the treeless field, but the wide open space made the cold-blowing winds unbearable. He continued across the field until he reached the opposite side where the woods rose up again, a dark wall of trees waiting to swallow him. He ventured back into their cover, feeling a strange comfort beneath their shadowed canopy as he pressed on. But just as he found a rhythm, he froze mid-step. Something made him pause. A noise, distant but unmistakable. What? His heart leapt. An airplane. He could hear it clearly, its low hum cutting through the silence of the forest. He craned his neck, searching the gaps between the treetops, willing his eyes to find it. Finally, he spotted it, just a glint of a shape slicing through the sky, cresting directly above him. Hope surged through him, fierce and blinding. He shouted, waving his arms wildly, his voice cracking. The plane flew on, gliding out of view, oblivious to the lone figure shouting below. Sean's cries grew desperate as it disappeared over the horizon.
No!
His voice broke, echoing back at him in the still woods.
No.
Defeat crashed over him, cold and unrelenting. His shoulders slumped as he sank to his knees, the last of his strength drained by that single futile hope. His breath came in ragged and shallow, his hands falling uselessly to his sides as he collapsed. Tears slipped down his face, melting the frost against his pale skin. Sean sat slumped where he had fallen, his back against a tree, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion. His clothes were damp, his fingers numb as he clutched a photo in his hand. His face streaked with tears, a hollow look in his eyes. All his strength, all his resolve had bled out of him, leaving him broken and defeated. He looked down at the photograph, the familiar face looking back at him with warmth and love. Sarah. The memories surged again, fragments of a life he could barely remember, but whose absence he felt like an ache in his chest. He saw her laughing in the sunlight, her fingers brushing his cheek, her soft voice calling his name. The memories overwhelmed him, piercing through the fog of his mind with a clarity that made his heart ache. With a shudder, he crumpled the photo in his hand and pressed it against his face, stifling his sobs as he let the grief wash over him. His shoulders shook, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as he broke into uncontrollable grief. He held on to the photo like it was the last part of him still alive, a tether to the warmth and comfort he'd once known. He leaned back against a tree, eyes closed, numb from the sorrow as his mind drifted into a dream. The scene shifted. He was moving through the woods, the landscape strange and surreal around him. He pushed through the snow, his breath puffing out in cold clouds. Then, just ahead, something familiar appeared through the trees. Almost too good to be real. A house. His house. Stunned, he stopped in his tracks, his heart racing, but it was unmistakable. He felt hope flare up within him, and he sprinted forward, feet crunching through the snow as he stumbled towards the front door. Bursting inside, he called out her name, but his voice was soundless, hollow words swallowed by the walls. He rushed from room to room, his hands grasping door frames, his eyes desperate as he searched. But every room was empty, silent, untouched. Panic gnawed at him as he rushed past the front window, stopping. Outside, he glimpsed his car parked on the road. Through the frosted window, he saw her, Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, her face looking towards him, still and expressionless. He bolted out the door, tearing across the snowy yard, his voice rising in silent shouts. Reaching the car, he yanked on the door handle, but it did not open. Banging on the window, he cried out, his voice audible only to him. But she didn't move. She stared ahead, a thin trickle of blood running down her forehead. His heart hammered as he tried to pry the door open, his knuckles white as he pounded on the glass, pleading with her. Then, without warning, the car began to roll backwards, the wheels gliding over the snow as if pulled by some invisible force. Sean's silent shouts grew frantic, reaching out desperately. But the car drifted further, disappearing into a swirling white blizzard that thickened and enveloped it. Sean watched helplessly as the storm swallowed the car, and with it, Sarah. The wind picked up, a harsh, cold sound that grew louder, filling his ears as the dream began to fade. A soft, familiar voice whispered through the cold.
Sean.
The sound drifted through his dreams, pulling him back from the edge of unconsciousness. His eyes snapped open, his breath catching as he found himself with his back against a tree in the heart of a snowstorm, the world around him swirling in a blinding blur of white. The cold was unforgiving, wrapping around him, sinking deep into his bones. His body was stiff, his fingers numb and unresponsive as he tried to push himself up. He squinted through the gusting snow, and there, through the shifting veil of white, he saw a figure in the distance. It was unmistakable, the silhouette, the way she stood, as familiar as his own reflection.
Sarah!
He rasped, but the wind swallowed his voice. He strained to focus, each gust blurring her image further, and then she was gone, vanishing like a phantom in the storm. A surge of desperation jolted him upright. He had to follow her. He had to know if she was real or a cruel figment of his mind. Bracing against the wind, he stumbled forward, each step a struggle as snow whipped around him, numbing his face and freezing his eyelashes until he could barely see. The storm bore down, relentless, its fury sapping his last shreds of hope. Every step was agony, and a growing dread gnawed at him. He couldn't survive much longer in this blizzard. His body was a prisoner of the cold, his mind swimming with exhaustion. But he pressed forward, fighting the agonizing thought that if he didn't make it out, he would die here, lost and forgotten. Blinded by the snow, he took a step forward, then suddenly the ground disappeared beneath him. His foot only found air as he tumbled headfirst over the edge of an embankment. The world spun, snow and earth flashing before him as he plummeted, his body slamming into branches and rocks on the way down. He hit the bottom hard, a sinking crack echoing through his body as he landed. Gasping, he found himself submerged in icy water, the stream biting into his cold skin as he struggled to pull himself up, his limbs like dead weight. He stumbled out of the water, his clothes drenched and clinging to him like ice. Pain shot through his leg, a blinding agony that stole his breath. He looked down, his stomach lurching at the sight. His fibula jutted grotesquely through the fabric of his pants, the bone slick and white against the harsh contrast of the blood that seeped into the snow. A raw scream tore from his throat, the sound swallowed by the storm. Through his haze of pain, he saw her again, Sarah, standing just beyond the trees, as still and silent as the falling snow.
What do you want from me? What do you want?
He cried out, voice ragged and desperate, his throat burning from the cold. But she gave no answer, only turned and disappeared again into the trees, her form slipping between the trunks like a ghost. His vision blurred, a mix of pain and snow that blinded him. Desperation forced him forward. Gritting his teeth, he began to drag himself, crawling through the snow, his broken leg trailing behind him. Every inch sending fresh agony through his body. He stumbled, hopped, and crept, crawling his way in her direction, driven by something he couldn't understand. His breath came in shallow bursts, his heart pounding as he forced himself to keep going, inch by inch, into the unrelenting storm. The light was fading quickly, the world around Sean blanketed in fresh snow as dusk began settling over the woods once again. Stumbling forward, his face dusted with a thin sheet of ice, his brows and beard frozen over. His clothes were stiff, frozen and heavy, the layers unyielding, barely protecting him from the cold that clawed at every inch of his skin. His movements were sluggish, his legs faltering under him as he tried to press on, leaving a trail of fresh blood in the white snow. He stumbled, tripping over his own numbed feet and collapsed onto his knees. The snow bit into his skin, but he tried to force himself back up, taking a few labored steps before falling once more. Desperation tightened his chest. He reached out, pulling himself to a nearby tree, his trembling hands scraping against the bark. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion and pain, scanned the silent woods. And there, through the trees ahead, he saw her. Sarah stood still, ghost-like, a vision bathed in the dim light of the fading day. She seemed almost unreal, an ethereal figure from his memories. Sean's gaze locked onto her and he felt his heart clench. But he knew she wasn't real, a figment of his imagination. Slowly, he tore his eyes away from her and looked around, scanning the bleak emptiness for anything he could use. His hands, now cracked and bleeding from the cold, moved carefully. Fingers stiff and unresponsive, he gingerly plucked twigs from the low-hanging branches, each movement causing a fresh pain to radiate up his arms. His pile of kindling was small and pitiful, but it was all he had. From his pocket, he pulled out the matchbook. Only one match remained. The thin matchstick trembled between his fingers as he realized the gravity of his situation. Digging into his wallet, he searched for any scrap of paper, something to help start a fire. But as he thumbed through the empty folds, he knew he had used everything he had. Only one item remained. The photo of Sarah, creased and worn. He stared at it, his heart heavy with the choice he was about to make. But survival clawed at him, more urgent than ever. Carefully, he placed the photo beneath the twigs. Then, with a shaky breath, he struck the match, watching the tiny flame flicker to life. Holding his breath and covering the flame, he lowered it to the photograph. The image of Sarah caught and burned, the edges curling as the fire took hold. For a brief moment, hope warmed him as the flames licked hungrily at the paper. But then a gust of icy wind swept through the trees and the fragile fire sputtered and died, leaving only the half-burnt photograph. Sean felt the weight of despair crash over him, his resolve shattering as he fell back against a tree, his silent tears freezing on his cheeks. Darkness closed in around him as the last of the daylight faded, swallowed by the heavy blowing snowfall. The sun rose on a clear morning, casting sunlight over the world. The storm had passed. A calm lay over the still, beautiful, fresh winter scene. The silence broken only by the hum of a stranger's car moving down an empty road. From inside, the view was through the windshield, where a pair of hands gripping the steering wheel could be seen. The car's radio murmured with the morning news.
The
the search continues for the driver involved in Friday's fatal car accident on a remote stretch of Highway 12 in which the female passenger lost her life. It is believed that the driver who was most likely hurt in the crash left the scene into the nearby woods in search for help. Search officials remain hopeful, but severe weather over the weekend has reduced the likelihood of survival. In other news, local schools and businesses remain closed after yesterday's sudden snowstorm.
The voice faded as the scene shifted to the woods where Sean sat slumped against a tree. His form was still, his head tilted and frozen forward in surrender to the relentless cold. Just ahead, only yards beyond the tree line, the car passed down the hidden road. Freedom, so close, yet just out of reach. Sean hadn't been able to see the road through the storm, and his strength had failed him before he could push any further. His hands clutched the remains of the photo, the edges charred, her image half burnt. It was the last piece of Sarah he held. And now it was clear. The spirit he had glimpsed, the vision he had clung to, had guided him towards safety, trying to show him the way. A figure stepped into view, looking down at Sean's frozen body. He wore the same clothes, a reflection or perhaps a remnant of who he had been. It was Sean himself, his spirit gazing down at his own lifeless body. His face softened by a strange peace. He took in the sight, the finality of his journey with a quiet acceptance. The scene transitioned, and now Sean stood inside the warmth of his home, gazing out the window. Outside, the familiar forest loomed, trees standing tall and silent. And it was there, in the window's reflection, that Sarah appeared, stepping out from the woods, moving slowly toward the home. She looked at him, a gentle smile on her face, and Sean felt his heart swell with joy. He turned and ran out towards her, his spirit free from the weight he had been carrying. In the reflection, he lifted Sarah into his arms, spinning her around. She held him close, and he kissed her, feeling the warmth of peace wrap around them. Their forms began to fade, the two figures slowly disappearing from the reflection. United at last in the afterlife.
Bad day, looking for a way home, looking for the gray escape. Gets in his car and drives away, far from all the things that we are. Puts on a smile and breathes it in and breathes it out. He says bye bye. Bye to all of noise. Always says bye bye. Bye to all of noise. Do 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 do.